Hello everyone, welcome to a dialogue between Chinese and English classics. I'm Professor 9 from the College of Foreign Studies of Jinan University.
And I am James, a guest teacher at the College of Foreign Studies of Jinan University. Professor Pu, I guess it is time for us to read Snyder's representative poems and examine the influence of the Buddhist philosophy in Snyder's poetry of nature.
That is exactly what we're going to do. Let's begin with a knowledge of Zen Buddhism and the Zen language. Zen, as a form of Chinese Buddhism, seems to always be puzzling to modern philosophers and linguists in the Western world, who are unable to decipher the sense of Zen thinking and the Zen ideology of language. To find out the reason, we may note at least one aspect of the paradoxical facts of Zen. The doctrine of Zen asserts that no logical or intellectual doctrine is applicable in obtaining the ultimate truth known as Buddhahood. It also holds that no word or speech is helpful in achieving the sudden enlightenment, which we call 顿悟 in Chinese, the beginning of entering Buddhahood. In a word, the Zen enlightenment is a primeval, pure experience of things as they are, transcending the shaping power of language. Zen Buddhists believe that human language and thinking create illusion and can't lead to enlightenment, which is the ultimate goal of Zen Buddhist practice.
So, how is the language affected by Zen ideology, since poetry relies heavily on language?
Good question. There is a preference for silence in Zen Buddhism that favors silent meditation. Such a preference for silence is a direct reflection of the Zen Buddhist linguistic ideology. The cultural conceptions of the nature, form, and the purpose of language and of communicative behavior as enactments of a collective order. We can sum up the Zen Buddhist linguistic ideology as having two seemingly contradictory positions on the use of language. On the one hand, there is a distrust and a denial of language and a yearning for silence. On the other hand, the non-logical, poetic uses of language are esteemed as a major requirement of Zen Buddhist training, particularly koan, which are short, paradoxical, and illogical statements, questions, or dialogues in Zen Buddhism. In fact, Zen Buddhist language ideologies are influenced by the practices and the tenets of Buddhism. Buddhism has its origin in the teachings of Siddhartha Gautama, who lived in India in the 6th century BC. He saw through the sufferings in life and after 6 years of ascetic practices, eventually achieved enlightenment and Buddhahood by sitting under the Bodhi tree. His followers, the Buddhists, do not believe in a creator God. Instead, the Buddhist teaching encourages people to examine their inner nature, which is pure and eternal. Once you discover this nature was in you, you get enlightenment and therefore become the Buddha. And the Zen Buddhist tradition goes, when the Buddha was going to teach the essence of Zen to his disciples at the Vulture Peak mountain, he held up a flower and revealed a smile on his face. When all the other disciples looked worried and puzzled, unable to figure out the implied meaning, Mahakasyapa nodded to the Buddha and smiled. Then the Buddha said to all, I have a treasury of the eye of the true Dhamma, the wondrous mind of Nirvana. I bless it to Mahakasyapa. In the future, do not let its propagation be cut off. The following short poem illustrates the essence of Zen, not found in words and letters, pointing directly to human mind, seeing into one's nature and attaining Buddhahood. This enlightenment involves seeing through your own essential nature and at the same time seeing through the essential nature of the cosmos and of all things. This is a story about the origin of Zen Buddhism and allusions used by generations of Chinese poets. In Chinese, it is 佛主拈花，迦叶微笑.
Thank you, Professor Pu, for your introduction of Zen Buddhism and its language. As I know, the second half of the 19th century witnessed Chinese immigrants settling in Hawaii and California and bringing Mahayana Buddhist practices with them. The result was the building of numerous temples. At the end of the 19th century, Dharmapala from Sri Lanka and Soyen Shaku, a Japanese Zen master, attended the World Parliament of Religions in Chicago, which marked the beginning of Buddhism flowering in the United States. Their soul-clean sung speeches on Buddhism were warmly received by their audience and contributed to the rooting of both Theravada and Zen Buddhist traditions in America. Buddhism began to influence American society in the second half of the 20th century. The Second World War, the Korean War, the flourishing materialism, and the deteriorating morality combined to grow Americans' interest in Buddhism. The American writers raised during the Great Depression and living through World War II were disillusioned with the post-war culture of conformity and materialism. The acculturation, which developed after the war, provided American poets with a new path to rid themselves of the backdrop of Cold War anxieties, urban sprawl, and conservative poetics. The literary and artistic groups in America were especially attracted to Buddhism for their artistic conceptions, plots, images, and metaphors. Soon, Buddhism gained a substantial following in America, and many Buddhist studies departments were established at American universities. In the 1950s and 60s, many Westerners came to be interested in Zen Buddhism, and English translations of Zen poetry anthologies were published. Buddhism inspired the Beats generation more deeply than any other religion, especially the Zen and Yogacara formulations of the Mahayana school.
Yes, exactly. Buddhism attracted poets like Slider and Kerouac because it seems to make sense of the central facts of human experience. That is, suffering and impermanence, and to affirm the poet's intuition that life was dreamlike and illusory. American poets like them tried to draw inspirations from the classical texts of Mahayana Buddhism, such as Lankavatara Heart Sutra, Vedanakirti Sutra, and the Gateless Gate. Meanwhile, incorporating Chinese shi and the Japanese haiku poems. And more importantly, tracing the origin of suffering in desires in the Buddhist Four Noble Truths. The Buddhist sutras seem to offer the way out for the depressed.
Marvelous! Can we trace the influence of Buddhist sutras in Snyder's poems?
Yes, as we know, Snyder's poetry was rooted in the Native American myths and religious experience. Under the influence of Buddhist masters like D.T. Suzuki, Snyder had done a great deal to popularize and propagate Buddhism in the West, both by publicly explaining it and by presenting a Buddhist perspective in his poetry. He read, studied, and wrote about the Upanishads, Vedas, Bhagavad Gita, and other Chinese and Indian Buddhist classics. Buddhism allows Snyder to merge the Western dualistic concepts of the human mind and nature. For him, they are interconnected and one does not differ from the other, and it provides an alternative philosophical framework for those philosophers disillusioned with the West. His work, in his various roles, reflects an immersion in both Buddhist spirituality and nature. His first two books of poems, Rip Rap and Myths and the Texts, are based on his experiences as a logger and a ranger in the U.S. Pacific Northwest. The Backcountry and the Regarding Wave manifested his fusion of Eastern religions, especially Zen Buddhism, into everyday life. Turtle Island, for which he won Pulitzer Prize, and Axe Handles are most remarkable in revealing his interest in them. Mountains and Rivers Without End is one of his best expressions of the Zen views on nature and language.
Great. That is to say, Zen Buddhism has inspired Snyder's interest in culture, the environment, and language. His work blends precise observations of nature with inner insight received primarily through his practice of Zen Buddhism. As I read, Southwest Review essayist Abraham Rothberg noted that the poet celebrates nature, the simple, the animal, the sexual, the tribal, the self. He sees man as an indissoluble part of the natural environment, flourishing when he accepts and adapts to that natural heritage, creating a hell on earth and within himself when he is separated from it by his intellect and its technological and societal creations. Snyder's involvement with Buddhism has been important to his poetry from the outset. Professor Pu, I propose that we read the following poem together. In the blue night, frost haze, the sky glows with the moon, pine treetops bend snow blue, fade into sky, frost, starlight. The creak of boots, rabbit tracks, deer tracks. What do we know?
Great! This is his well-known Pine Tree Tops, which can be regarded as Snyder's representative Zen poem. The poem best demonstrates the charm of Zen in nature poetry. And I would like to read in Chinese. 在蓝色的夜里，霜雾，天空散着光华，伴着月亮，松树冠弯向雪蓝，融入天空，霜，星光，竹靴的枝旮，兔迹，露影，我们知道什么？The first 5 lines of the poem depict the scenery, drawing a simple yet profound picture of Zen flavor. The moon, the pine tree top, the sky and the snow are passed by the starlight, with no traces of human interference. The human is part of the same, or the human is the same. According to Zen Buddhism, the moon symbolizes the Buddha nature, the fresh and cool thing, the ideal atmosphere for achieving nirvana. The active creaking of boots and the static footprints of deer and rabbits blend perfectly, which is the essence of Zen aesthetics.
That's a wonderful interpretation. I cannot wait to read more of Snyder's poetry of Zen wisdom. As for what I read, Snyder not only uses Chinese aesthetics and religious philosophy to inform his poetry, but as a challenge to the repressive climate of early Cold War 1950s American culture. In this sense, Snyder's poetry creates a tension between representing Chinese poetry and using China as an idealized space for transformative poetics, both depending on exclusions of actual Chinese from mainstream American culture.
Yes, to conclude, Snyder's accessible style, drawn from the examples of Japanese haiku and the Chinese verse, has created a new kind of poetry that is direct, concrete, non-romantic, and ecological. Snyder's work will be remembered in its own right as an example of a new direction taken in American literature. We've now reached the end of our unit about Gary Slider and the Cold Mountain poems. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.